Into Britain they come by the thousands and tens of thousands. England in wartime is the land of blood, sweat, and tears. A nation blackened and battered by the fury of the Nazi Luftwaffe. But it's still England. And for young Americans on their way to war, there is much to see. Wartime Britain is a place supercharged with excitement.
World War II saw the US and UK form a very special relationship. Working together and sharing intelligence that would significantly help towards a victory. An alliance that continues to this day. But how did it all begin? To piece together how it happened, historians and experts from both sides of the Atlantic examine the course of history from their perspective. They'll take us through the breakthroughs of intelligence.
Intelligence and security that protects the West is mostly born out of this collaboration, and it's not created easily.
The challenges and obstacles along the way, and the code-breaking techniques and successes.
Perhaps the most important attribute that shaped this early relationship was patience, but patience paid off.
And a glimpse into the world of the codebreakers themselves.
It's pretty fantastic if we have a look inside.
A little collection of photos of a baseball game which took place at Bletchley. It doesn't really get much more American than baseball.
In 1943, the continuing main focus of American intelligence in the Pacific was the Japanese main fleets themselves. This was predominantly learned through the mainline Japanese code system, JN-25.
The Japanese Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku was the guiding light behind the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and the operation at Midway that attempted to trap American fleets. He was considered our most dangerous opponent, and I believe he was probably the greatest naval strategist on any side during the war. In 1943, the Americans decrypted a message that gave the admiral's itinerary for a frontline visit. Generals and admirals believe that they can inspire the troops by going to forward areas when, of course, most troops would rather they just stayed back. But nonetheless, this gave a very precise itinerary for Admiral Yamamoto. The message was sent forward as a SIGINT report with an analyst's comment that said, "Let's get the bastard." It was arranged that American aircraft would fly to intercept Yamamoto at his most forward spot. The American forces had just gotten a new type of aircraft. It was the first that had the range to go from American forward positions to this Japanese base. A number of pilots flew at ocean wave level virtually for the entire distance. A very important, impressive feat of aerial navigation. Yamamoto was known to be a stickler for punctuality. And the American planes arrived just as he was about to land at the Japanese base. They shot him down. It was a serious loss for the Japanese. In addition to being such an impressive strategist, Yamamoto was a great hero to most in Japan. And in fact, his death was kept secret for quite some time after he was shot down, because of the negative effect it would have on Japanese morale. This was an operation that was set up almost entirely by a SIGINT decrypt, one of the few actions of the war that was based on a single message. But it was an important message, and it was an important operation. The Japanese naval officers who were his successors were competent. They were not brilliant as he was. This operation based on SIGINT greatly affected the rest of the Pacific War.
Yamamoto's death was directly attributable to the US being able to read the Japanese code JN25. However, there were other Japanese code systems used, and solving these were important in very specific kinds of operations.
One important one that was solved by the Army by women cryptanalysts was known as the water transport system, or sometimes called 2468. Japanese, as an island nation, had a fleet of merchant ships that carried supplies to and from the Japanese home islands, but they also carried military goods and reinforcements and replacements for the Japanese units that were deployed throughout the Pacific. This fleet of ships, sometimes called the Maru Fleet, each ship every day at noon would have to radio an encrypted position report to the fleet headquarters in Japan. This report would, of course, give its location, would cite its cargo, its expected arrival at its destination, and so on. Once the solution to the water transport code was made, this information, minus the source, was radioed to American submarines in the Pacific. And it was common after that for American submarines to surface into a target-rich environment. And the Japanese war effort was severely crippled because the submarines were able to eliminate a very large part of the tonnage of these civilian ships that serviced both the Japanese civilian economy and the military.
However, as the war progressed, difficulties between the British and Americans began to arise, particularly in the Pacific.
Even where there's a strong political will and a positive desire by the parties concerned to share intelligence and share signals, in the Pacific this wasn't always straightforward.
First of all, you have to consider the great distances involved, and that communications devices themselves, much less the cryptographic devices that were used on them, were still relatively in their infancy. Radio was a device that really is associated only with the 20th century. It was developed at the beginning of the 20th century, and even by World War II, the technical people were still trying to understand fully its properties and how to make it even more effective. So communications across the Pacific were rather difficult at best.
It's a big place, and the code breaking, unlike Bletchley where everybody is in one site, the code breaking is very dispersed. It's happening in Colombo or Kilindini in Kenya. It's happening in Australia. It's happening in Hawaii. It's happening in the United States. And so just getting information from one of those places to another is really, really difficult. It has to be done by wireless.
The matter was further complicated because often they weren't using devices that were compatible with each other.
Both the British and the Americans used their own encryption systems for that kind of traffic. And there was a real reluctance by both sides to share their own encryption technology with the other party. So they're faced with the problem. How do you share stuff between British codebreakers and American codebreakers? The solution is they come up with a device called the combined cipher machine, which is not a machine, it's actually two machines. What they do is they modify the American ECM machine sufficiently that it can talk to a British Type-X machine, and they modify the Type-X machine in the same way so it can talk to ECM. So although the machines are different at either end, they're sufficiently similar. They both have rotors in, a bit like an Enigma. they're sufficiently similar that they can talk to one another.
Even the Army and the Navy had difficulty in the United States alone communicating with each other because they were not always using compatible equipment. And of course, that problem is exacerbated when it's an American trying to communicate with a British colleague or vice versa.
The problem is the Americans are already circulating a huge volume of signals information among their own stations using their own internal ECM machine. And if they want to send stuff to the British, it's down to somebody to re-encrypt all that material onto the CCM system so it can be sent to the British. So it kind of doubles the workload for those people. And as a consequence of this, the system never really gets working as well as it might because everybody's very busy. The American codebreakers and the people who are sending their traffic around are very busy already, and the British aren't really a priority for them. So right up to nearly the end of the war, the FECB, which has moved back to Colombo by that point, is struggling for enough material to work on.
So there were plenty of technical communications problems, quite apart from the technical problems involved in producing SIGINT.
This is a diagram of what would become the BRUSA network, which shows the cable and the wireless connections between the UK, the USA and Australia, all discussing Japanese traffic. Now, while all of these locations such as Washington DC, Hawaii, places in, like I say, the UK and Australia, whilst they're all very neatly represented on here, those locations are obviously distributed all the way around the world. And so these networks, these communication systems were really well established in the pre-internet era to transfer thousands of messages every single day between each of these people.
There's nobody that doesn't want to defeat Hitler, but keeping the British Empire in India was another matter. One good example of this is in the area that the Americans called the China-Burma-India theater. The British interests, of course, were in protecting their empire as represented in India and Burma. The Americans were concerned with ejecting the Japanese invaders from China. And many American officers, young men largely, who worked at the American SIGINT establishment in India, cooperated very well with the British SIGINT office in India, but they did not see eye to eye over colonial policy or empire policy. Many of the Americans were actually against the British Empire, but they did their duty, and of course it helped. They helped cooperate to save India and Burma, recover Burma, and the British did cooperate to help the nationalist Chinese fight the Japanese invaders. But I think neither side was really happy about the situation in the subcontinent. But the SIGINT cooperation was the dominant factor and kept the relationship going despite differences in opinions on outside matters.
Bletchley, we're very fortunate that the European war is not very far away, and the American personnel can come and work literally in the same room as their British counterparts or their Canadian counterparts, and the operation is very streamlined as a result. Simply the fact in the Pacific that you have bases scattered all or over, half the surface of the Earth makes life much more difficult. So while they're still struggling in the Pacific, arguably in Europe, everything is going very well from a signals point of view.
American officers, even senior officers, really had no experience with intelligence in general, much less signal intelligence. General Eisenhower, in writing his memoirs, mentioned how the subject never came up at the senior Army command schools that he attended. There was no training in it. And in fact, Eisenhower, as a junior officer, used the designation for intelligence, G2, as a synonym for guessing. Intelligence was not respected. But as the Americans raised a very large army, as was deployed literally around the world, commanders realized they could not do without intelligence. And this is where the U.S. and British SIGINT relationship came in. As early as the experience in North Africa, Eisenhower recognized that there was no American general or colonel qualified to be his intelligence officer with the size of the forces he was commanding and the area responsibility that he had. So he selected a British general as his intelligence officer. This general taught him how to use intelligence, and more particularly how to use signals intelligence. Eisenhower became very good at it. And he took this intelligence officer with him when he became the commander-in-chief in Britain, planning the D-Day operation. And this officer taught Americans subordinate to Eisenhower as well how to use intelligence. And remember, in teaching General Eisenhower how to use intelligence, sort of inadvertently, the British were also teaching President Eisenhower how to use intelligence. But the British expertise in intelligence was of undoubted value to the Americans, and many officers like Eisenhower recognized this key contribution.
In England, General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his deputy commanders chart the liberation of a lost continent, plan when and where the mighty armies of the United Nations will strike. Today, northern France is that battleground.
By the time you get to 1944 in the European theatre and dealing with Enigma in particular, the integration of US personnel into Bletchley that we've talked about before becomes really, really significant, and the Bletchley becomes a really joined up operation at that point. One of the also very significant aspects of it is where the intelligence is going.
One of the great problems with SIGINT is getting the information, getting the decrypt to the user who needs it. In all theaters of war, the end users were a very limited number, usually only the very senior commanders and their intelligence staff.
Not only are Britain and America collaborating on producing the intelligence, but they're very, very closely collaborating on its distribution. And how that works is, for Enigma in particular, when German messages were broken, both in the lead up to D-Day and once operations had started in France, each of the senior commanders, be they British or American, so Eisenhower, who's in charge of everything, Montgomery, who's in charge of 21st Army Group, the Canadian generals, the more junior American generals, they all have what are called SLUs. These are these liaison units that attach to their headquarters who can receive Enigma intelligence, Ultra, directly from Bletchley Park. So what happens is Hut 3, the British and the American team in Hut 3 decide what intelligence these particular commanders in the field need, what will be particularly useful to what they're doing, and that is transmitted directly to them, initially by wireless, but later after D-Day, they actually lay a cable across the channel. Everyone's heard of the oil pipeline Pluto, but equally important was they laid teleprint and telephone wires across the channel as well, because the volume of information they were trying to transfer to operational commanders was absolutely huge.
The SLU would take the decrypt and show it to the commander, the intelligence officer, or anyone else at the headquarters who was authorized to read this kind of material. And once that had been done, the SLU would take it back, and it would usually be burned so that it could not be mislaid or captured if the headquarters were attacked.
And what's striking is that this intelligence is being provided regardless of nationality. Each commander is getting what they need regardless of their nationality. And this had actually started in 1943 in Italy. Actually in Sicily, Patton US General Patton is the first American to receive Bletchley Park intelligence direct in that way. And that continues for the remainder of the war. So you're seeing a really integrated operation.
The Americans modeled their system for distributing SIGINT almost entirely on the British model. At first, we also called them SLUs, but after a while, as more Americans got involved, they were called SSRs for Special Security Representatives, or SSOs for Special Security Officers. This system applied throughout the world in Second World War, and the Americans kept this same system modeled on the British original for many years after the war also. This was something that the British influenced us deeply on. Before World War II began for the Americans, before Pearl Harbor, our distribution was very limited. There were probably less than 24 people in the United States outside the production unit that was authorized to read SIGINT. So you can see the distribution problems there were not very great. The Americans had no experience in distributing great volumes of SIGINT and distributing it over vast distances, over continents, over oceans. And so the British model provided the Americans with what it needed to get the job done.
The story of Enigma in the latter part of 1944 and 45 isn't completely successful, on the other hand. D-Day is remembered as an intelligence success. Bletchley Park had the opportunity to spend several years, in fact, collecting information about the German army, and the operation had been planned again over several years, so everyone had plenty of time to work out what was happening. Once the battle starts in Europe, there are later operations where the timescale is much shorter. The so-called Bridge Too Far operation, the Arnhem airborne landings in Holland in September 1944, the intelligence isn't as good for that operation. Rather notoriously, there are more German troops, including SS tank divisions, on the ground than was fully appreciated by the planners. And there has been a lot of historical discussion of how effective Enigma was at revealing what was going on with the Germans. As always in these things, it's not just about the intelligence, it's about who the commanders are, how much they appreciate the intelligence, and also the politics between them. In that situation, while the feed out to the front might be very seamless from Bletchley, you have Montgomery and Patton, who by that point are in direct competition with one another. And Montgomery wants to have the Arnhem operation almost come what may, because he's worried that all the resources will otherwise go to Patton, and Patton will have a more successful campaign than Montgomery does. So it's not just a case of sending out intelligence. The other problems can arise along the way. Similarly, in December, you have the Battle of the Bulge, which is very famous in the United States because although the German offensive was stopped relatively quickly, the cost to the American army was huge. They suffered enormous numbers of casualties. And there is discussion again about how much the attack could have been predicted and whether there was an intelligence failure. In fact, the Germans have, even though they don't know Enigma is being broken, they take fairly standard security precautions. They don't mention the operation to anybody on wireless at all, really, before it happens. And only very few people who really need to know that it's going to happen at all are told. And that's done in person. So they keep the Battle of the Bulge operation off the air, effectively. And the result of that is that the Allies aren't able to learn about it, because if you don't broadcast it, if you don't send an Enigma message about it, Bletchley can't read it, so you can't know. And it does reveal the weaknesses of signals intelligence from that point of view, that if German generals talk to each other in person or talk to each other on the telephone, there's nothing we can do about it. It's only if they transmit their thoughts to the airwaves via wireless that we find out.
Victory in Europe brought wild rejoicing throughout the Allied world as the Big Three announced the downfall of Nazi Germany. New York's celebration is typical of the nation's joy at the end of nearly 6 years of war in Europe. It's a great day as a thankful people let loose their pent-up emotions.
As the war came to an end, the question of continuing to share intelligence grew.
There is quite a strong argument for things going back to how they were. As we've heard, before the war, Britain was doing its intelligence independent of the United States. The two weren't really very closely allied. Britain was still prepared to stand on its own feet. And so there is an argument to say we don't need to collaborate with anybody anymore. But at the same time, the British are an occupying power in Germany, along with the French and the Americans and the Russians, and the former allies of the war are kind of standing, in control of large portions of the world, and there's a good argument for keeping on good terms with each other and continuing to collaborate.
I don't believe the Americans really had a clear picture of what was ahead. Remember that the concept of intelligence operations in general, plus the more specific intelligence operations for SIGINT, were very new to the Americans. We've never had a government agency in peacetime to do this kind of work. We've never had a national intelligence organization or a national SIGINT organization. There was a feeling that they needed to continue the British relationship. It had been so important during the war. I think those who actually used the material recognized the British contribution to it, that it wasn't just an American show, it was a cooperative effort.
5 years of working with the Americans has built up really good relationships. A lot of the famous figures from Bletchley, Frank Birch, Edward Travis, Harry Hinsley, Denniston have all travelled to the US and met their American equivalents, both in the Army and the Navy, and many of those Americans have come to Bletchley either temporarily or semi-permanently, and so the professional relationships are really, really good, and so there's a lot there to build on for the future.
We're going to need intelligence. What form that would take, I don't think there was any clear consensus. But of course, this was a secret endeavor. The debate over what shape SIGINT enterprise should be was very much behind the scenes with a very limited number of people, but they also represented divergent interests in the Army, the Navy, State Department even. So there was no consensus, except that they were going to need it.
What's noticeable about the negotiations in late 1945 is it's the people at the more junior professional level who go over and make the arrangements.
Travis and Tiltman particularly, who I think understood pretty well how to deal with Americans, had a large part in shaping American expectations.
One person in particular, Eric Jones, who's been the head of Hut 3, in May 1945, Hut 3 ceases to be of any significance because the war against Germany has been won, but he has been at the heart of the code-breaking operation. And he is one of the people that goes to America along with Harry Hinsley to iron out how things are going to be in the future as sort of professional to professional. As we've seen before, quite apart from the strategic advantages of sharing intelligence, both the British and the Americans still want to be to maintain their knowledge base, to know everything there is possible to know about code breaking. So if the other is doing anything interesting, they want to know about it.
It is also worth considering that the relationship continued partly because we just knew too darn much about each other.
Both sides are very keen that they should retain parity and that both of them should know what the other's up to. And the UKUSA agreement, which is signed in 1946, the spring of 1946, is a reflection of that.
These documents were donated by Harry Hinsley. Now, Harry Hinsley was a member of Naval Section during World War II, but after the war, he went to Washington with Edward Travis and John Tiltman to negotiate GCHQ's long-term relationship with the US, which would become the UKUSA agreement. these documents were very necessary for that journey because he was a civilian. He was a civilian all the way through the war. And so because he was a civilian and because GCNCS was a secret organisation, he needed permission to travel on the secret mission, and he needed to be let through customs in a way that wouldn't hinder him. So these documents represent that journey. Now we can see that he is proceeding to Washington on a special mission of an urgent and secret nature. It's a document by the Foreign Office which basically lets him through American customs unhindered. And this one is his passenger clearance from British Overseas Airways Corporation, which would become British Airways eventually. And we can actually see on here that he was sponsored by FO, the Foreign Office, that F.H. Hinsley, who was living in Bletchley, in Simpson, Bletchley in Buckinghamshire. And these are his travel details for October 1945. We can even see his signature here at the bottom.
What's striking about that is the agreement is actually drafted by Harry Hinsley, and you have to remember that at this point Harry Hinsley is still in his 20s, he's still a young man, but such is his the respect that's held for him by everybody concerned that he's put front and centre in this process, and the Americans trust him, and he can do the job. And in November 1945 he drafts the fundamentals of the agreement. Basically, the two sides will share everything they know about other people's codes and ciphers and communications. They are allowed to keep secret their own communications, and they also promise not to spy on each other, which is fairly important, and had been a problem in the 1920s and 30s, so it's obviously something that both sides were concerned about. So he drafts out the skeleton of the thing. The problem is that these kind of agreements, the devil's in the detail, and it actually takes until March 1946 to come up with a full agreement treaty that can be signed. And basically the version that you see in spring of 1946 is the version that Hinsley wrote in November, with a whole pages and pages of technical appendices and other sort of explanatory bits that say what they actually mean by the key terms. So it ends up being quite a long document.
In order for it to be effective, it really had to be a secret.
The agreement is extremely secret. It doesn't receive sort of presidential signature or anything in the US. It's signed by officials from the departments on both sides of the Atlantic. And that allows the collaboration at the professional level and the intelligence sharing to continue. And that agreement, it's actually signed as another BRUSA agreement of Britain-USA, but it is the foundation of the intelligence sharing relationship that continues right down to this day.
We have to remember that this is nearly unprecedented in world history, perhaps unprecedented fully, that two countries would voluntarily cooperate to a very intimate extent in such a sensitive activity. SIGINT is one of the most fragile and sensitive activities a country can engage in. Yet the Americans and the British were sharing not 100% everything, but pretty close throughout the war and after.
Nowadays, the treaty is known as the UKUSA agreement, the UKUSA agreement, and that is because the name was changed in the 1950s. And so nowadays we talk about UKUSA. Increasingly as well, when it's talked about, it's referred to by another catchphrase, if you like, which is 5 Eyes. 5 Eyes refers to the principal countries that are involved in the arrangement nowadays, and that's the UK and the USA, but also Australia, New Zealand and Canada. Now, Australia, New Zealand and Canada weren't in the picture at the very beginning, even though the Australians and New Zealanders had been participating in Japanese code breaking during the war, and Canada obviously been involved with Enigma and the Battle of the Atlantic and all of that. The British initially thought that they could represent all their dominions perfectly well, that the Americans only needed to talk to the British and the British would talk to their colonies and dominions on their behalf. What the Canadians thought about that isn't really recorded, but the Americans certainly weren't very happy because they had a very close relationship with Canada. It's their immediate next door neighbour, and they were used to dealing with Canada direct. and they didn't like the idea that they had to go through London to get to Ottawa. It seemed daft to them. So one of the clauses in the treaty is that the US, in addition to talking to Britain, are allowed to talk to the Canadians directly. The concession they do make is that they can, if they do so, they will keep Britain in the loop when they do it. They'll tell the British if they're talking to the Canadians, and the Canadians likewise will tell the British when they talk to the US. So from the outset, the Canadians are kind of a third party to the treaty. And then in the later 40s and 50s, the other dominions come on board, Australia and New Zealand, to make up the Five Eyes that we have today. In fact, as the 20th century continues, other countries are incorporated. So West Germany, some of the countries in Scandinavia, other NATO members are included, but they don't become sort of full signatories to the thing. They're what they're referred to as kind of third-party countries, and they also contribute intelligence and receive information in return. So the UKUSA agreement is the basis of a kind of NATO-wide intelligence sharing operation, and is very successful. It also remains deeply secret. It's not until the 1970s and the early 1980s that anybody gets really any wind of this at all. Interestingly, in Australia in the 1970s, the story breaks that the Australian intelligence services are collaborating with Britain and the US, and it causes something of a scandal because the then Prime Minister of Australia didn't know, and so he finds out rather late in the day. As I say, in the 80s and 90s, the thing became more and more public knowledge, and eventually in 2010, the actual text, or most of the text of the agreement, was made public by the NSA in America and by GCHQ in Britain. So we can now read the UKUSA agreement from 1946 in a way that for 60 years we couldn't. So what actually goes on with it obviously still remains very secret, but we now know that it exists. So long as the Soviet threat persists during the Cold War, the reason for UKUSA, the reason for collaboration among the Five Eyes is really obvious, and that's the main glue that holds them together. But if you look at it in detail, while they agree on most things, they don't necessarily agree on everything. The UK continues to have its own foreign policy, the US does likewise, and they don't always see eye to eye. A particular area of dispute, if you like, is the Middle East. Britain, of course, is a former colonial power in Egypt, in Palestine, in the Gulf region, and you see a divergence of foreign policy aims in that region, and particularly during the Arab-Israeli conflicts of the 1960s and 1970s, there is a tension, certainly at the political level, between what Britain's trying to get out of it and what the Americans are trying to get out of it. But what's notable about the UKUSA agreement is that at the professional level, the relationship is robust enough and the personal relationships are good enough that they're able to carry on and they're able to acknowledge the areas where they have a different view, but it doesn't break down the relationship. Everything still carries on. And that's notable since the end of the Cold War. We're 30 years on now, and the relationship is still as strong as it ever was, even though the threats to the various countries are incredibly diverse now, and our foreign policy interests are incredibly diverse. The Five Eyes relationship remains really, really strong, and that's built on that agreement signed in 1946. Of course, while the negotiations are going on around the UKUSA agreement with the Americans, the British have to decide what they're going to do with Bletchley Park. The Second World War is over, but threats still remain. The Cold War, the competition with Soviet Russia, began before the war finished, really. And so there is clearly still a threat, and there's clearly still a need for the kind of work that Bletchley was doing, albeit on a smaller scale. And in 1946, this site is given up, and GCNCS moves back into London. They moved to Eastcote, which was where they'd had one of their large bomb facilities during the war. And they set up in Eastcote for a couple of years. And then in the early 1950s, they moved to Cheltenham, where GCHQ is today. Where exactly the name change happens is a bit how long is a piece of string. The terminology, Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, appears in paperwork as a cover name for the organisation even quite early in the Second World War. So GCHQ as a term is already floating around, but GC&CS ceases to be used and the organisation becomes known as GCHQ. What's notable about GCHQ after the war is, although it's a smaller organisation than the wartime GC&CS at Bletchley Park had been, there's a huge amount of continuity. Many of the people who worked at Bletchley during the war go on to work at Cheltenham, and people who've been in more junior roles rise to be heads of the organisation. Eric Jones, who was from Hut 3, went on to be director of GCHQ later on. Another example is John Tiltman, who, great codebreaker during the war, he carries on working at Cheltenham with GCHQ for many years after, and indeed when he retires from GCHQ, he works as a consultant in his retirement for the NSA in America, and actually moves to America and lives there for a continued period. So there's a lot of continuity of personnel, and expertise and knowledge is carried on into GCHQ after the war. The character of GCHQ after 1946 is really shaped in many ways by the UKUSA agreement. The way the organisation works and how it's structured is predicated, at least in part, on the fact that they have this closer relationship with what becomes the NSA in America, which was created in the 1950s. And had GCHQ not been collaborating so closely with America and the other Five Eyes members, I think GCHQ would look very different from the organisation it is today.
SIGINT effort in the United States had been essentially fragmented. Two fragments, the Army and the Navy. They grew up with separate SIGINT services, even spoke sort of a separate SIGINT language. All through World War II, the American Air Force had been subordinate to the Army, but it became an independent service in 1947. So now we had three military entities competing for SIGINT budgets, SIGINT personnel. The State Department recognized the need for SIGINT, that there were many facets of our diplomatic relations that could not be adequately conducted without this kind of inside information. And also the Office of Strategic Services felt it ought to have both the product and a say in how the product is produced regarding SIGINT. So I had a lot of new players, all competing for a diminishing pool of personnel and a diminishing budget. So under heavy pressure from the Secretary of Defense and the President, they created what became known as the Armed Forces Security Agency, which was to be the national coordinator for SIGINT. This was created in 1949 to try to bring some semblance of order out of the 4 or 5 competing entities that were interested in SIGINT. And of course, get the best SIGINT bang for the buck that was possible. AFSA, the Armed Forces Security Agency, was a great idea, but its execution was really poor. The director of the organization did not have enough authority. The budget was stingy. It did not have a good internal management. These weaknesses were exposed as it provided support during the Korean War, which began in 1950. Many of the senior generals in the Korean War who had gotten SIGINT during World War II complained about the quality of the SIGINT service they were getting in Korea. So President Truman called a study, and out of the study came recommendations to create a central organization that had some real organizational structure, strength, and sanity maybe. So in an executive order following the recommendations of his Blue Ribbon panel, President Harry Truman reformed, reorganized, reestablished the Armed Forces Security Agency in October 1952. And when he did so, just to show that it was intended to be a new situation, he renamed it the National Security Organization. And NSA took over the international partnerships that the Armed Forces Security Agency had managed, and NSA became the entity with which the British SIGINT establishment cooperated. Many people who worked SIGINT during World War II did go on to very important careers. Perhaps the most prominent was one of the SLUs, a lawyer named Lewis Powell, who was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by President Richard Nixon. Another important figure, not exactly an SLU, but perhaps the most senior American SIGINT official in Europe, was a person named Telford Taylor, another lawyer. He became the American chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials. A number of the other people became prominent in SIGINT or in intelligence. Abraham Sinkoff, one of the 4 people who composed the team that visited Bletchley Park in 1941, became a senior SIGINT person and retired in 1960 as one of the most honored figures in American SIGINT. Leo Rosen, an Army person, the engineer, electrical engineer who had been on that mission, became one of the chief research and machine support managers at NSA. Prescott Currier, the Navy lieutenant who was on that 4-person mission, stayed with Navy SIGINT, rose to the rank of captain. He served both in field positions and senior positions at NSA. And the 4th member of that team, Robert Weeks, went back into general Navy duties rather than SIGINT duties after the war. Did work SIGINT for some periods after the war, but he retired as a Rear Admiral in 1971. So these were exceptional people to begin with, and their careers took them to very prominent positions. George Hurley, an American sergeant who was an analyst at Bletchley Park, was interviewed about 30 years after the war about his experience, and he said that it had shaped his entire life since then. And as he looked back on it, he said that it really is a terrible thing to think that the most important experiences of his life had been related to war. But he said that they were the most exciting things he'd ever done, and the urgency and importance and everything wrapped into one stellar crowd of people surpassed any period we've been discussing about in the post-war. It affected his life, affected his family's life, and the world.
There's a tendency in the UK to look at the Second World War as if it was a British enterprise, and clearly it wasn't. We were part of an Allied coalition in which the Americans and even the Soviets played a huge part. So it wasn't Britain that won World War II. It was an Allied effort that did that, and within that we often talk about Bletchley Park in isolation as if these British codebreakers were sitting in this country house doing this work without really engaging with anybody else. What the UKUSA and Five Eyes story tells us is that really right from the beginning, from 1940, there's a recognition that this stuff needs to be shared and other countries need to be collaborated with, and the US in particular has the potential to be a really strong and useful partner.
As I look back on this long, strange journey that the Americans and the British have taken together in the field of SIGINT, I sometimes can't help but think it really was a miracle. I think that without this cooperative relationship, the Second World War would have ended much, much differently and much, much less happier than it did end.
Given the relationship in the 1920s and 1930s, it's quite a leap in the dark for both sides to say we should collaborate this fully. No one's done it before. It's not what really happens in wars. So there's a real debt we owe to the imagination of both the people at Bletchley Park and the people in the US code-breaking organisations, that they can see the advantages of collaborating with each other and taking this forward. And there's a second leap of faith at the end of the war in 1945, 1946, that both sides realise this relationship is worth maintaining and pursuing and carrying on with. And the world we live in today is the legacy of the Second World War in many ways.
As you look back on this relationship, it was designed, I should say, for the benefit of these two nations in their war-making efforts, and then in their attempts to adjust to a changed world after 1945. But I think you can see a larger truth here as well, that this relationship has helped keep the peace through the Cold War and the age of terrorism.
Intelligence and security that protects the West is mostly born out of this collaboration that is created during World War II. And it's not created easily. It's a struggle, as we've heard. They have challenges all the way along the way, both physical and political. But the fact that they're able to conquer all those challenges and come up with the integrated relationship that they have is a real tribute to those involved, and is something that we should celebrate here at Bletchley Park.
The relationship ended up not just benefiting these two countries by themselves or their group of allies, but did benefit, and I believe continues to benefit, the entire world.